For generations, the people of Israel had lived with something that defined their identity more than anything else. The certainty that God spoke into their history, not occasionally, not vaguely, but clearly, repeatedly, and through identifiable moments, through prophets, through written messages, through warnings, corrections, and promises that shaped decisions, kingdoms, and entire lifetimes. When crisis came, they expected a word. When confusion rose, they looked for direction. And when they failed, they anticipated correction. Then, without announcement, it stopped. There was no official declaration, no final dramatic speech explaining what was about to happen. No recorded moment where God said, "This will be the last message for centuries." Instead, what followed was something far more difficult to process. Silence that extended beyond a single generation, beyond memory, and eventually beyond expectation itself. Tonight, we're going to follow this period step by step, in a literal and factual way. Without speculation or poetic interpretation, we will begin with the last confirmed message recorded before the silence, examine the historical and political conditions that surrounded it, and trace how the Jewish world changed as one empire replaced another. We will look at how leadership structures evolved, how religious practices adapted, and how expectations about God's intervention began to shift under pressure. This matters because the silence did not happen in isolation. It unfolded during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. The Persian Empire gave way to Greek domination. Greek culture spread across the region. After that, Roman power emerged, bringing a different kind of control. Each transition reshaped daily life, religious identity, and the way people understood their place in the world. At the same time, something else was happening internally. Without a recognized prophetic voice, authority began to shift toward groups who interpreted existing laws rather than receiving new revelation. Traditions developed, interpretations multiplied, disagreements formed, and over time distinct religious factions began to appear, each claiming to represent the correct understanding of God's will. This created a growing tension. The people still had the words of the past, but no confirmed voice in the present. And that tension raises a direct question that we will return to throughout this narrative. If God had established a pattern of speaking into history, what explains his silence that lasted nearly 400 years? Some traditions suggest this period was a form of judgment. Others see it as preparation. Historical records show increasing instability, external pressure, and internal fragmentation. But none of those explanations fully remove the weight of the central fact. There was no widely recognized prophet whose message was accepted as the direct voice of God during this entire span. This absence affected more than theology. It influenced politics, leadership decisions, resistance movements, and expectations about the future. Without new revelation, people relied more heavily on interpretation. Without clear direction, different groups began to define obedience in different ways, and as a result, unity became more difficult to maintain. As we move forward, we will follow the sequence carefully. We will begin with the final recorded message before the silence, then move into the Persian period where that message was delivered, and continue through the rise of Greek influence, the conflicts that followed, and the eventual transition into Roman control. At the edge stage, we'll look at what changed, why it changed, and what consequences followed. Because this silence, when examined closely, was not empty. It was filled with developments that directly shaped what came next. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Also, based on what you already know, do you think this period of silence was intentional, preparation, or a withdrawal of direct communication? Now, we go back to the final moment when a message was recorded and recognized as coming directly from God. Just before everything went quiet, The final recorded message before this long period of silence is traditionally associated with the prophet Malachi, whose writings are placed at the end of what is now known as the Old Testament. His ministry is generally dated to the 5th century BC, during the time when the Jewish people had already returned from exile in Babylon and were living under the rule of the Persian Empire. This context matters because the people were no longer displaced, no longer in captivity, and had already rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Outwardly, it appeared that restoration had taken place, but internally, serious problems were developing. Malachi's message does not begin with comfort or reassurance. It begins with confrontation. He addresses a community that still maintained religious practices but had begun to drift in attitude and integrity. Priests were offering sacrifices that did not meet the standards established in the law. Animals that were blind, lame, or sick were being presented as offerings, which directly violated earlier commands. This mattered because the sacrificial system was not symbolic alone, it was central to how the people related to God. By lowering the standard of what they offered, they were revealing a deeper issue. Their reverence had weakened. The message extends beyond the priests. Malachi speaks to the broader population, confronting issues such as dishonesty, injustice, and unfaithfulness in relationships. Marriage covenants were being broken. Justice was being distorted. And yet, despite these actions, there was a growing attitude among the people that questioned whether serving God made any real difference. Some began to say that evildoers seemed to prosper, while those who tried to remain faithful saw no clear reward. This shift in perception is critical, because it shows that the issue was no longer just behavior, it was belief. At this point, the message introduces a distinction within the community. Malachi describes a group who still feared God and spoke with one another about him. According to the text, their names were recorded, indicating recognition and preservation. This mattered because it shows that even in a period of decline, there remained a subset of people who continued to take their relationship with God seriously. The presence of this group prevents the narrative from becoming one of total collapse. Instead, it becomes a divided condition. Outward structure remained, but internal consistency was fractured. The message then shifts toward a future-oriented warning. Malachi speaks about a coming day that would bring judgment, comparing it to a burning furnace that would consume the arrogant and those who acted wickedly. At the same time, he describes a different outcome for those who feared God, using the image of healing and restoration. This dual outcome introduces a forward tension. The current state of the people is not final. There is an approaching moment that will separate outcomes based on response and alignment. One of the most significant elements in this final message is the reference to a future messenger. Malachi speaks of someone who will come before this decisive moment, preparing the way and turning hearts. This is not presented as a vague idea, but as a specific sequence. First, a messenger who prepares, then a moment of direct intervention. This matters because it creates an expectation that extends beyond Malachi's own time. It implies that although the current message is concluding, the story itself is not ending, it is moving toward a later development that has not yet occurred. The book concludes with a directive that connects past revelation to future expectation. The people are instructed to remember the law given through Moses, reinforcing continuity with what had already been established. At the same time, they are told to anticipate the coming of a figure associated with the spirit of Elijah, who would act before the arrival of the decisive day. This combination of remembering what was given and watching for what is coming creates a bridge between past and future, but it leaves the present without new instruction. And then the record stops. There is no immediate follow-up. No additional prophet appears to expand or clarify these statements. No new writings are recognized as carrying the same authority in the period that follows. The system continues. The temple remains. The law is still read and practiced, but the pattern that had existed for centuries, where prophets would rise, deliver messages, and be recorded as authoritative voices, does not continue in the same way. This absence is what defines the beginning of the silence. It is important to understand that the silence does not mean inactivity. Life continues. Leadership structures remain. Empires still rule. Conflicts still occur. But what changes is the absence of a widely recognized, authoritative voice that is accepted as delivering new revelation from God. This distinction is critical because it shifts how decisions are made. Without new messages, interpretation of existing texts becomes the primary method of guidance. At this point, the question is no longer theoretical. The last message has been delivered. The expectation of a future messenger has been established, but no immediate fulfillment appears. So what happens next? As we move forward, we will step into the historical period immediately following Malachi's message, where the Persian Empire still holds control, but underlying shifts are already beginning to form. These changes will not be sudden, but they will be decisive, setting in motion a chain of events that reshapes the entire region. And as those changes unfold, the silence remains. After the message of Malachi, the Jewish people remained under the authority of the Persian Empire, which had already allowed them to return from exile and rebuild Jerusalem, including the temple. This period is often viewed as relatively stable when compared to what would come later. But that stability needs to be understood carefully. It was political stability under foreign rule, not independence. And more importantly, it was a period where no new prophetic voice emerged to guide the people through ongoing changes. The Persian administrative system organized territories into and Judah often referred to as Yehad. In Persian records functioned as one of these smaller regions. Local governance existed, but ultimate authority rested with Persian officials. This mattered because it limited the ability of the Jewish population to make autonomous political decisions. Leadership within the community became more focused on maintaining internal order, preserving religious identity, and ensuring compliance with imperial expectations, rather than pursuing national sovereignty. During this time, the temple in Jerusalem remained the central institution of religious life. It was the focal point for sacrifices, festivals, and communal gatherings. However, without a prophetic figure actively correcting, guiding, or confronting the people, the role of religious leadership shifted. Priests and scribes began to carry more weight in interpreting the law and applying it to daily life. This shift did not happen instantly, but it became increasingly significant as time passed without new revelation. This mattered because the nature of authority was changing. Previously, prophets could challenge both priests and leaders, often delivering messages that disrupted established practices. Now, without that external corrective voice, authority became more concentrated within existing structures. Interpretation of the law became the primary method of guidance, and those trained in reading, preserving, and explaining the texts gained influence. At the same time, the memory of earlier prophetic activity was still present. The writings of figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel were known, studied, and referenced. These texts provided a framework for understanding covenant, judgment, and restoration. But they were anchored in past events. They addressed earlier crises, earlier exiles, and earlier promises. The challenge now was applying those texts to a present that no longer had a living prophetic voice to interpret current events with the same authority. This created a subtle but important shift in how people related to God's word. Instead of receiving new messages that addressed immediate situations, the community increasingly relied on studying and interpreting what had already been given. This approach required discipline, education, and systems for preserving texts accurately. As a result, scribal activity became more structured, and the transmission of the law took on heightened importance. Another key factor during this period was the geographical spread of the Jewish population. Not all Jews had returned to Jerusalem after the exile. Many remained in regions like Babylon and other parts of the Persian Empire. This dispersion meant that Jewish identity was no longer tied exclusively to one location. Communities developed outside of Jerusalem, and maintaining a consistent understanding of the law across these locations became more complex. Without a central prophetic voice, differences in interpretation could begin to emerge more easily. Despite these changes, the expectation that God could intervene had not disappeared. The people still had the promises recorded in earlier texts. They still had the memory of deliverance from Egypt, the establishment of the kingdom, the warnings of exile, and the return that followed. These events formed a historical pattern that suggested God was actively involved in their history. The absence of new messages did not erase that pattern, but it introduced uncertainty about when or how the next intervention might occur. This is where the silence begins to take on a different dimension. It is no longer just the absence of prophets. It becomes a test of how the community functions without direct, current instruction. Do they maintain the standards established in the past? Do they adapt those standards to new conditions? Do they begin to lower expectations, assuming that the era of direct communication has ended? At these days, there is no clear indication that the people fully understood what was happening. There is no record of a collective realization that they had entered a prolonged period without prophetic guidance. Instead, life continued within the structures that were already in place. The temple functioned, the law was read. Leadership operated, but the longer the silence extended, the more its effects began to accumulate, and those effects would not remain contained. Because while this period appears stable on the surface, larger forces were already in motion beyond the borders of the Persian Empire that would soon disrupt this balance and introduce a level of change that the existing structures were not prepared to handle. As the Persian period continued, the absence of a recognized prophetic voice began to produce gradual but measurable changes in how religious life was structured and maintained. These changes did not occur as a reaction to a single event, but as a series of adjustments that developed over time, without new revelation to address current circumstances. The responsibility for preserving and applying the law shifted more heavily onto those trained to interpret it. This is where the role of scribes became increasingly central. Scribes were not simply copyists. They were educated individuals who studied the law in detail, preserved its transmission, and explained its application to the people. This mattered because the authority they carried was derived from their knowledge of existing texts rather than from receiving new messages. As a result, interpretation began to take on a more structured and systematic form. Over time, this would lead to the development of traditions that aimed to clarify how the law should be followed in situations not explicitly addressed in earlier writings. At the same time, the priesthood continued to function within the temple system. Sacrifices were offered, festivals were observed, and the structure of worship remained intact. However, without prophetic oversight, there was less external correction when practices began to drift. This does not mean that corruption immediately overtook the system, but it does mean that accountability relied more on internal discipline than on direct confrontation from a recognized messenger of God. This created a dynamic where two forms of authority operated simultaneously: priestly authority, centered on ritual and temple function, and scribal authority, centered on interpretation and teaching. These roles were not necessarily in conflict during the early part of this period, but the balance between them would become more significant over time. This mattered because it laid the groundwork for later divisions within Jewish society, where different groups would emphasize different aspects of religious life. Another important development during this time was the continued influence of Persian policies on local governance. The Persian Empire was known for allowing a degree of cultural and religious autonomy within its territories. As long as loyalty and tribute were maintained for the Jewish population, this meant they were able to practice their religion without the kind of direct suppression that had occurred under earlier empires. However, this autonomy had limits. Political power remained external, and any significant unrest could lead to intervention. This environment contributed to a focus on internal stability. Religious leaders were not only responsible for maintaining spiritual practices, but also for ensuring that the community did not create political problems that would draw negative attention from imperial authorities. This mattered because it subtly influenced decisions. Maintaining order became as important as maintaining correctness, and in some cases, the two goals could compete. Me'an will. The Jewish population outside of Jerusalem continued to grow and stabilize in various regions of the Persian Empire. These communities, often referred to as part of the diaspora, faced a different set of challenges. They were surrounded by other cultures, languages, and religious systems. Maintaining identity in these environments required adaptation. Practices had to be sustained without direct access to the temple, and teaching became a key method of preserving continuity. This dispersion increased the importance of shared texts, without a central prophetic voice to unify interpretation. Consistency depended on how accurately the law was transmitted and understood across different regions. Variations in practice could emerge more easily, especially when local conditions influenced how certain commandments were applied. This mattered because it introduced the possibility of divergence within the broader community, even while a shared heritage remained. At the same time, expectations about the future did not disappear. The writings of earlier prophets contained promises of restoration, justice, and a coming figure who would play a decisive role in Israel's future. These expectations remained part of the collective understanding, even without new messages to clarify their timing or nature. The absence of prophetic updates meant that these expectations were held in a kind of suspended state, neither fulfilled nor reinterpreted with new authority. This created a growing tension between what had been promised and what was currently experienced. On one hand, the people had returned from exile and re-established key elements of their religious life. On the other hand, they remained under foreign control, and many of the broader promises such as lasting peace, complete restoration, or a clearly established kingdom had not been realized. This gap between expectation and reality did not disappear. It continued to build quietly over time. By this point, the silence was no longer just an absence. It was becoming a condition that shaped behavior, structure, and expectation. The longer it continued, the more the community had to define itself without direct, current input from what had once been a consistent source of guidance. And this raises a critical question moving into the next phase. How long can a system built on revealed instruction continue to function when no new instruction is given? Because while these internal adjustments were taking place, something much larger was approaching, something that would not allow the existing balance to remain unchanged. As the years passed under Persian rule, the absence of a prophetic voice began to produce consequences that were no longer subtle. What had started as a gradual shift in authority and structure now became a defining condition of the community. The system continued to function, but it was operating without one of its original components: direct, recognized revelation, addressing present circumstances. One of the clearest consequences was the increasing dependence on interpretation rather than instruction. Without new messages to clarify how existing laws applied to changing conditions, scribes and teachers were required to bridge the gap. This mattered because interpretation, by nature, introduces variation. Even when grounded in the same text, different conclusions can emerge depending on emphasis, method, and context. At this stage, those differences were not yet formalized into distinct sects, but the foundation for division was forming. Some emphasized strict adherence to the written law, focusing on precision and preservation. Others were more concerned with practical application in everyday life, especially in environments outside Jerusalem. These approaches were not necessarily incompatible, but they did not always produce identical results. Over time, those differences would become more pronounced. Another consequence was the growing distance between religious practice and political reality. The people continued to follow their traditions, observe festivals, and maintain temple worship. But politically, they remained under foreign authority with limited control over their future. This mattered because earlier prophetic messages had often addressed both spiritual and national conditions together. Now, without that integrated guidance, the connection between religious obedience and political outcome became less clear. This uncertainty affected expectation. The promises recorded in earlier writings had not disappeared, but their fulfillment seemed delayed. The idea of a coming intervention, whether through a leader, a restoration, or a decisive act of judgment, remained part of the collective memory. However, Without new prophetic clarification, the timing and nature of that intervention became less defined. Expectation did not vanish, but it became less specific and more open to interpretation. At the same time, generational change began to play a role. Those who had direct memory of earlier prophetic activity were no longer the majority. New generations grew up knowing the texts, but not the experience of hearing a recognized prophet speak in their own time. This mattered because it subtly altered how authority was perceived. The past remained authoritative, but the present lacked the same immediate. This shift also influenced how leadership was viewed. Priests and scribes were no longer complemented by prophets who could challenge or confirm their actions. As a result, their influence became more stable but also less externally correct. In a system where authority is not regularly tested by an independent voice, the risk of imbalance increases over time, even if the initial intentions remain aligned with established law. Be thy's point, the silence had extended long enough to reshape expectations. It was no longer perceived as a temporary pause. It had become the normal condition. The community continued, adapted, and maintained its identity, but it did so without the element that had once provided direct, situational guidance. And just as this condition was becoming established, the external world was about to change in a way that would disrupt everything the people had grown used to. Because the Persian Empire, which had provided relative stability, was approaching its end, and what would replace it would introduce a level of cultural and political pressure, far beyond what the current system had been built to handle. By the end of the Persian period, the structure of Jewish life had become defined by continuity without new revelation. The temple was functioning, the law was preserved and taught, and leadership roles were established around priests and scribes. What had changed was not the existence of the system, but how it operated. It no longer depended on an active prophetic voice to guide present decisions. Instead, it relied on the preservation and interpretation of what had already been given. This mattered because it created a form of stability that was internally sustained but externally vulnerable. As long as the political environment remained relatively consistent, the system could continue without major disruption. But it was not designed to absorb rapid or forceful change from outside powers. And that is exactly what was approaching. The Persian Empire, which had ruled the region for over 2 centuries, was beginning to weaken. Internal challenges, combined with the rise of a new power to the west, created conditions for a major shift. That new power was led by Alexander the Great, whose military campaigns would rapidly dismantle Persian control and replace it with a different kind of rule. This transition was not gradual from the perspective of those living in the region. It was decisive. As Alexander advanced, cities fell, administrative systems were replaced, and cultural influence began to spread quickly. For the Jewish population, this meant that the political framework they had adapted to under Persian rule was no longer in place. A new system, with different expectations and pressures, was taking control. What made this shift particularly significant was not only the change in leadership, but the introduction of Greek culture, language, and social structures. Unlike the Persians, who generally allowed local traditions to continue with minimal interference, the spread of Greek influence, often referred to as Hellenization, encouraged integration into a broader cultural system. This included language, education, philosophy, and public life. This mattered because it introduced a new type of pressure. The challenge was no longer simply maintaining identity under a foreign political authority. It was maintaining identity while being surrounded by a dominant culture that promoted different values, practices, and ways of thinking. This created decisions that earlier generations had not faced in the same way. To what extent should Greek customs be adopted? How should traditional laws be applied in a changing environment? And who had the authority to answer those questions? At the same time, the silence continued. No new prophetic voice emerged to interpret these changes or provide direct guidance on how to respond. The community was left to navigate a rapidly shifting world using texts and structures that had been established in a different context. This increased the pressure on existing leadership and amplified the importance of interpretation. The transition from Persian to Greek control marks a turning point in the 400-year period. It is the moment where external change begins to move faster than internal adaptation. The system that had been stable under one empire is now tested under another, and the results will not remain uniform. Because as Greek influence expands, it will not affect all groups in the same way. Some will adapt, others will resist, and those different responses will begin to divide the community more clearly than before. And through all of it, the central condition remains unchanged. There is still no recognized prophetic voice providing new revelation. As we move into the next act, we will follow the rise of Greek control in detail, examine how Hellenization reshaped daily life, and trace the early signs of division that would eventually lead to open conflict. The silence continues, but the tension is increasing. The transition from Persian to Greek control began with a rapid military campaign led by Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC. Within a relatively short period, Alexander defeated the Persian forces and took control of vast territories, including the region of Judea. This was not a slow administrative shift. It was a decisive transfer of power that redefined the political structure of the entire Near East. Alexander's approach to empire building differed significantly from that of the Persians. While he allowed local governance to continue in many areas, he actively promoted the spread of Greek culture. This included the use of the Greek language, the establishment of cities modeled on Greek systems, and the integration of Greek education, philosophy, and social practices. This process is commonly referred to as Hellenization. This mattered because it introduced a new layer of influence that extended beyond politics. Under Persian rule, the Jewish population had maintained a relatively stable religious and cultural identity with limited external interference. Under Greek influence, that identity was now interacting with a dominant cultural system that encouraged participation and adaptation. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire did not remain unified. Instead, it was divided among his generals, leading to the formation of several Hellenistic kingdoms. Judea initially came under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty, based in Egypt. During this early phase of Greek rule, conditions remained relatively manageable for the Jewish population. The Ptolemies generally allowed local religious practices to continue, similar to the Persian approach, while still promoting Greek administrative and cultural systems. One of the most significant developments during this period was the increasing use of the Greek language. Over time, Greek became the common language of administration, trade, and intellectual life across the region. This mattered because it affected how ideas were communicated and how communities interacted beyond their immediate environment. For Jewish communities living outside of Judea, especially in places like Alexandria, this shift was even more pronounced. As a result, the Hebrew scriptures began to be translated into Greek, producing what is known as the Septuagint. This development was practical, allowing Greek-speaking Jews to access their foundational texts, but it also introduced a new dimension: the interpretation of sacred texts within a different linguistic and cultural framework. Translation is not neutral. It involves choices that can influence meaning. This mattered because it added another layer to how the law and earlier writings were understood. At the same time, Greek cities, institutions, and educational systems began to shape the environment in which Jewish communities lived. Gymnasiums, theaters, and philosophical schools became part of the broader cultural landscape. Participation in these institutions often required a level of cultural adaptation that could conflict with traditional practices. This created decisions that were not purely theoretical. They affected daily life, social status, and opportunities. Within Judea, the impact of Hellenization was initially less aggressive, but it was still present. Trade, administration, and external relations increasingly involved interaction with Greek systems. Over time, this exposure began to influence internal discussions about identity and practice. And throughout this entire transition, the silence continued. There was no recognized prophetic voice to address the implications of these changes directly. No new message clarified how far adaptation could go or where limits should be drawn. The community had to rely on existing texts and leadership structures to navigate a situation that those texts had not specifically addressed in detail. This is where the tension begins to take a new form. It is no longer just about maintaining faith without new revelation. It is about maintaining identity while being actively shaped by an external culture that is expanding rapidly and influencing nearly every aspect of life. And this pressure will not remain uniform, because as Greek control continues and shifts between different ruling powers, the question of how to respond to Hellenization will become more urgent and more divisive. As Greek influence became more established across the region, its effects within Jewish society began to move beyond surface-level interaction and into deeper questions of identity and practice. What had initially been an external cultural presence was now becoming an internal point of decision. The issue was no longer whether Greek systems existed, it was how individuals and groups would respond to them. Under the continued rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, daily life in Judea remained relatively stable compared to what would come later. Religious practices continued, the temple functioned, and there was no immediate attempt to suppress traditional worship. However, this stability coexisted with increasing exposure to Greek customs, language, and social expectations. Over time, some members of the Jewish population began to adopt aspects of this culture more openly. This mattered because cultural adoption was not neutral. Participation in Greek institutions such as education systems or civic life often required alignment with values and practices that did not fully match traditional Jewish law. For some, this adaptation was practical. It provided access to economic opportunities, political influence, and broader social integration. For others, it represented a compromise that risked weakening core identity. As a result, a division began to form, not yet formalized, but clearly present. On one side were those who saw value in engaging with Greek culture to varying degrees. On the other were those who viewed such engagement as a threat to religious integrity. This division was not defined by geographies alone, that existed within communities, within leadership structures, and sometimes within families. At the same time, leadership roles became more complex. The position of the high priest, which held both religious and administrative significance, began to intersect more directly with political considerations. Under foreign rule, the high priest often functioned as a representative figure between the Jewish population and the governing authority. This meant that decisions about leadership could be influenced by factors beyond purely religious qualifications. This mattered because it introduced a new type of tension: the alignment between religious leadership and external power. If a leader was perceived as too accommodating to Greek influence, it could create internal resistance. If a leader resisted too strongly, it could create tension with the ruling authority. Balancing these pressures was not straightforward, and without a prophetic voice to provide clear direction, decisions were made within a limited framework of interpretation and judgment. Meanwhile, Jewish communities outside of Judea, particularly in cities like Alexandria, were experiencing a different version of this interaction. In these environments, Greek culture was dominant, and adaptation was often necessary for participation in public life. Over time, these communities developed ways of maintaining their identity while engaging with the surrounding culture. However, the way they approached this balance was not always identical to the approach within Judea, adding another layer of variation within the broader population. The use of the Greek language continued to expand, reinforcing its role as a unifying medium across different regions. This facilitated communication and trade, but also influenced how ideas were expressed and understood. The translation of sacred texts into Greek, while practical, meant that key concepts were now being interpreted through a linguistic framework that was not originally used to convey them. This did not immediately alter the core message, but it introduced subtle shifts that would become more significant over time. BD's point: the silence had extended across multiple generations. It was no longer something that people expected to end quickly. Instead, It had become an accepted condition. Even as its effects continued to shape decisions and structures, the absence of new revelation meant that every response to these cultural pressures relied on interpretation rather than direct instruction. And that interpretation was beginning to diverge. As Greek influence continued to expand and political controls shifted between different Hellenistic powers, the existing divisions would not remain contained. They would deepen, formalize, and eventually lead to conflict that could not be managed through internal adjustment alone, because the next phase would not be defined by gradual influence but by direct intervention that forced a clear choice between adaptation and resistance. The balance that had existed under Ptolemaic control did not last. Around the early 2nd century BC, control over Judea shifted from the Ptolemies to the Seleucid Empire, a rival Hellenistic power based in Syria. This transition introduced a more direct and forceful approach to governance, particularly under the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Unlike earlier rulers who had largely allowed local traditions to continue, Antiochus implemented policies that significantly intensified the pressure of Hellenism. This marked a turning point. Under Antiochus IV, efforts to unify the empire culturally became more aggressive. In Judea, this included direct interference with established religious practices. The temple, which had remained the central institution of Jewish life, became a focal point of this intervention. According to historical sources, practices that were foundational to Jewish identity, such as circumcision, observance of the Sabbath, and adherence to dietary laws, were restricted or outright prohibited. This mattered because these were not peripheral customs. They were core elements of the covenantal identity established in earlier texts. Restricting them was not simply a political act, it was a direct challenge to the way the people understood their relationship with God. At the same time, the internal divisions that had been developing began to intensify. Some individuals within the Jewish leadership supported aspects of Hellenistic alignment with Greek culture as a way to gain stability or favor under Seleucid rule. Others viewed these actions as a violation of the law and a departure from established identity. These differences were no longer theoretical. They were expressed in decisions, alliances, and public actions. One of the most significant developments during this period was the alteration of the temple itself. Historical accounts describe the introduction of practices within the temple that were inconsistent with its original purpose, including the dedication of the altar to a foreign deity. This event is often referred to as the abomination of desolation. This mattered because it represented a direct transformation of the most sacred space in Jewish religious life into something aligned with external authority and practice. For many within the community, this crossed a threshold that could not be ignored or adapted to. The question was no longer how to balance tradition with cultural influence. It became a matter of whether core identity would be maintained or abandoned under pressure. The response was not uniform. Some accompanied, whether out of agreement, fear, or pragmatism. Others resisted, choosing to maintain traditional practices despite the consequences. This resistance was not initially organized on a large scale, but it was decisive at the individual and local level. Families, leaders, and small groups made choices that defined their position in this conflict. This mattered because it transformed the nature of the tension. What had previously been a gradual divergence in interpretation became an active confrontation between opposing responses. The absence of a prophetic voice during this time is particularly significant. There is no recorded figure delivering a new message to unify the response or provide direct instruction on how to proceed. Instead, decisions were made based on interpretation of existing law and personal conviction. The pressure from Seleucid policies did not create the divisions, it exposed and accelerated them. BT's point, the silence had taken on its most challenging form. It was no longer just the absence of guidance during stability. It was the absence of guidance during crisis. The people were facing direct threats to their identity, and yet no new prophetic message appeared to address the situation. And this leads directly to what happens next. Because when pressure reaches a level where adaptation is no longer possible, resistance begins to organize. What starts as individual defiance can develop into coordinated action, and that is exactly what will emerge in the next phase. The silence continues, but the response is about to become visible. The pressure introduced under Antiochus for epiphanies did not remain uncontested. As restrictions intensified and core practices were directly targeted, resistance began to take a more organized form. This shift did not begin as a large-scale movement, but as a localized response. It quickly expanded. One of the key figures associated with this resistance was a priest named Mattathias, who, according to historical accounts, refused to comply with the imposed practices and initiated an act of defiance that became a catalyst for broader rebellion. This moment mattered because it transformed passive resistance into active opposition. After Mattathias, leadership of the movement passed to his son, Judas Maccabeus, who organized and led a series of military actions against Seleucid forces and their supporters within Judea. These were not conventional battles between equal powers. The resistance forces were smaller and less equipped, but they relied on mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and a clear objective: to restore the ability to practice their religion without interference. The conflict that followed is commonly referred to as the Maccabean revolt. Over time, the resistance achieved a series of strategic victories that allowed them to regain control over key areas, including Jerusalem. One of the most significant outcomes of this revolt was the recapture and rededication of the temple. After being altered under Seleucid authority, the temple was cleansed and restored to its intended purpose. This event became central to Jewish historical memory and is commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. This mattered because it represented a partial reversal of what had occurred under Antiochus IV. The most sacred institution had been reclaimed, and the ability to perform traditional practices was re-established. From a structural perspective, this looked like restoration. The system that had been disrupted was functioning again. However, the restoration was not complete in every sense. The revolt led to the establishment of a new ruling dynasty, often referred to as the Hasmonean dynasty, which combined political and religious authority. This created a different kind of leadership structure than what had existed before. Previously, kingship and priesthood had distinct roles. Now, those roles were increasingly combined within a single leadership framework. This mattered because it introduced new questions about legitimacy, authority, and the proper alignment of leadership roles, according to earlier traditions. At the same time, the divisions that had developed earlier did not disappear. If anything, they became more defined. Different groups held different views on how the law should be interpreted, how strictly it should be applied, and how leadership should function. These differences would eventually contribute to the formation of more clearly identifiable factions within Jewish society, and still, the silence remained. Despite the scale of these events, the suppression of traditional practices, the revolt, the restoration of the temple, and the establishment of a new ruling structure, there is no record of a widely recognized prophet emerging to interpret these developments as direct messages from God. There are historical writings from this period, but they were not universally accepted as carrying the same authority as earlier prophetic texts. This absence is critical. It means that even during one of the most significant crises and recoveries in this entire period, the people were still operating without new, recognized revelation. Decisions were made based on existing law, historical memory, and leadership judgment, but not on newly delivered prophetic instruction. This creates a clear pattern as we move forward. Major events are happening, but the mode of guidance has not returned to what it once was. The revolt resolves the immediate crisis, but it does not resolve the deeper condition of silence. And as the Hasmonean rule continues, new internal tensions, political ambitions, and external pressures will begin to shape the next phase of this 400-year period, because stability, once again, will prove to be temporary. After the success of the Maccabean revolt led by Judas Maccabeus and his successors, Judea entered a period of partial independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. This marked a significant change from previous generations. For the first time since the exile, Jewish leadership held both political and religious authority within the region. On the surface, this appeared to fulfill a long-standing expectation. The restoration of self-rule, combined with the reestablishment of proper worship. This mattered because it created a sense of resolution after a prolonged crisis. However, the structure of this new leadership introduced complexities that would shape the next phase of the silence. The Hasmonean rulers were not from the traditional Davidic royal line. Instead, they were priestly figures who had taken on both the role of high priest and political ruler. This combination of roles was not part of the earlier model established in the scriptures, where kingship and priesthood were distinct. The merging of these roles raised questions about legitimacy, even as the system continued to function. At the same time, the expansion of Hasmonean control brought new challenges. As territory increased through military campaigns, the leadership had to manage not only religious practice, but also governance over diverse populations. This required administrative decisions, alliances, and enforcement strategies that extended beyond temple-centered leadership. Political considerations became more prominent, and maintaining control required ongoing action rather than simple restoration. This mattered because it shifted priorities. Leadership was no longer focused solely on preserving religious identity under foreign rule. It now had to balance religious responsibilities with political stability, territorial management, and external threats. These competing demands did not always align perfectly with the expectations found in earlier texts, which had been shaped under different conditions. During this period, the interpretation of the law continued to develop. Without new prophetic input, different groups began to emphasize different aspects of how the law should be applied. Some focused on strict adherence to written commandments, prioritizing precision and separation from external influence. Others were more flexible in their approach, particularly in matters related to governance and interaction with surrounding cultures. This is where the early formation of identifiable groups begins to take shape. Although not yet fully formalized, distinctions were emerging between those who would later be known as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These groups differed in their approach to authority, interpretation, and tradition. The Pharisees placed strong emphasis on the detailed interpretation of the law and the development of oral traditions to guide daily life. The Sadducees, often associated with priestly and aristocratic leadership, focused more on the written law and maintained a closer connection to temple authority. This mattered because it introduced structured disagreement within the leadership itself. These differences were not purely academic. They affected decisions about how the law was enforced, how leadership functioned, and how the community responded to internal and external pressures. Without a prophetic voice to resolve these disagreements or establish a unified direction, these groups developed their positions independently, each claiming alignment with the established law. At the same time, the broader population was influenced by these developments. The existence of multiple authoritative interpretations created a more complex religious environment. People were not only following the law, they were navigating different explanations of what that obedience required. And still, the silence continued. There was no new, widely recognized prophet to address the legitimacy of Hasmonean rule, to resolve emerging disputes, or to clarify how the law should be applied in this new political context. The system functioned, but it did so without the element that had once provided direct, unified guidance. As a result, authority became more distributed, more debated, and more dependent on interpretation. And this distribution of authority would not remain stable, because as power consolidates and differences deepen, internal tension begins to rise not only between groups, but within the structure of leadership itself. As Hasmonean rule continued, the initial sense of restoration began to give way to more complex realities. What started as a movement focused on preserving religious identity had now become an established governing power. This shift introduced new priorities that extended beyond defense and restoration into expansion, administration, and long-term control. Under leaders such as John Hyrcanus, the territory of Judea expanded significantly through military campaigns. Neighboring regions were brought under control, and in some cases, populations were incorporated into the Jewish state under conditions that included adopting certain religious practices. This mattered because it represented a departure from earlier patterns. Expansion was no longer simply about survival, it involved active political and territorial ambition. With expansion came increased complexity in governance. Managing a larger and more diverse population required administrative systems that could operate beyond the temple-centered structure. Decisions had to be made regarding taxation, law enforcement, and relations with neighboring powers. These responsibilities required a level of political strategy that was not the primary focus of earlier religious leadership. At the same time, the combination of religious and political authority within the Hasmonean leadership began to generate internal tension. The high priest was not only responsible for temple functions, but also for decisions that affected the entire state. This dual role created situations where political necessity and religious expectation did not always align. When conflicts arose, there was no external prophetic voice to clarify which priority should take precedence. This mattered because it placed greater weight on human judgment within leadership decisions. Meanwhile, the divisions between emerging groups became more defined. The Pharisees continued to emphasize detailed interpretation of the law and the importance of applying it consistently across all areas of life. They developed frameworks that extended beyond the written text, aiming to address situations that the original law did not explicitly cover. This approach increased their influence among those who sought clear guidance for daily practice. On the other side, the Sadducees, often associated with the ruling class and temple leadership, maintained a more direct focus on the written law and the authority of the priesthood. Their position aligned more closely with the existing power structure, which gave them political influence, but also tied their identity to the stability of the ruling system. These differences were no longer subtle. They influenced how decisions were made at the highest levels and how authority was perceived by the broader population. This mattered because it created competing centers of influence within the same community. Instead of a unified approach to law and leadership, multiple perspectives operated simultaneously. Another factor contributing to internal strain was the increasing interaction with surrounding powers. Even as the Hasmoneans maintained a degree of independence, they were not isolated. Alliances, conflicts, and negotiations with neighboring states were part of maintaining control. These interactions introduced additional pressures, particularly when external expectations conflicted with internal priorities. As these dynamics developed, the earlier sense of clear restoration became more difficult to sustain. The system was functioning, but it was under strain from multiple directions: internal division, political expansion, and external pressure. And throughout all of this, the silence remained unchanged. There was still no recognized prophetic voice to address the legitimacy of expansion, the merging of authority, or the growing divisions within the community. Each group continued to interpret the law and the situation based on its own framework, without a unifying message to resolve the differences. This absence did not stop progress, but it did allow tension to build without resolution. And as leadership becomes more contested and priorities become more divided, the risk of internal conflict increases. Because when authority is shared but not unified, the next phase is rarely stability, it is confrontation. As Hasmonean rule continued to expand and consolidate power, the internal tensions that had been developing began to move toward open conflict. What had started as differences in interpretation and emphasis between groups was now influencing political decisions, leadership, legitimacy, and the stability of the entire system. The combination of religious authority and political control within a single ruling structure was no longer sustainable without challenge. One of the clearest points of tension emerged around the question of legitimacy. The Hasmonean rulers, while successful in securing independence and restoring the temple, were not from the traditional royal lineage associated with David. This mattered because earlier expectations about leadership had been shaped by the idea of a Davidic line. As a result, even though the Hasmoneans held power, their position was not universally accepted as fully aligned with those earlier frameworks. This issue became more visible under rulers such as Alexander Jannaeus, whose reign highlighted the growing divide between leadership and segments of the population. Historical accounts describe increasing conflict between Jannaeus and groups aligned with Pharisaic interpretation. These conflicts were not limited to debate. They escalated into violence, indicating that disagreement had moved beyond theory into direct confrontation. This mattered because it showed that the internal structure of authority was breaking down. At the same time, the distinction between the Pharisees and the Sadducees became more clearly defined. The Pharisees continued to develop detailed interpretations of the law, emphasizing application in daily life and extending guidance beyond the written text. Their influence grew among the broader population, particularly among those who were not directly connected to the temple or political leadership. The Sadducees, by contrast, maintained their association with the temple and the ruling class. Their authority was tied to the existing power structure, and they generally resisted the expansion of interpretive traditions beyond the written law. This alignment with leadership gave them influence, but it also connected their position to the stability of the ruling system itself. These two groups were not merely offering different perspectives, they were shaping different models of authority. This mattered because it created parallel systems within the same society. One emphasized interpretive expansion and adaptability. The other emphasized established structure and direct textual authority, without a prophetic voice to unify or correct these approaches. Both continued to develop independently, reinforcing the division. Meanwhile, the broader population was affected by these conflicts. Political instability, leadership disputes, and shifting alliances created uncertainty. The initial promise of restoration under Hasmonean rule was now complicated by internal fragmentation. What had been gained through resistance was now at risk from within. Another critical factor was the increasing involvement of external powers. As internal conflicts intensified, different factions sought support from outside forces to strengthen their position. This introduced a new level of vulnerability. External intervention, once invited, rarely remains limited. This mattered because it set the stage for a transition that would fundamentally alter the political landscape. Beyond these points, the silence had persisted through multiple generations, across different forms of leadership, and through both stability and conflict. It had not been broken during restoration, nor during expansion, nor during internal crisis. The absence of a recognized prophetic voice remained constant, even as everything else changed. This creates a clear pattern. Events are escalating, but guidance is not. And when a system faces internal division and begins to rely on external powers to resolve its conflicts, the outcome is rarely independence, because the next phase will not be defined by internal disagreement, but by external control reasserting itself. In a decisive way, the internal divisions within Judea eventually reached a point where they could no longer be managed internally. Conflicts over leadership, legitimacy, and interpretation had weakened the stability that the Hasmonean dynasty once provided. What had begun as a successful revolt and restoration had gradually transformed into a system marked by rivalry, political ambition, and unresolved tension between competing groups. This instability created an opening for external intervention. One of the defining moments came when rival factions within Judea sought support from outside powers to secure their own position. This decision mattered because it shifted the balance of control. Instead of resolving internal disputes independently, leadership became dependent on external authority. Once that door was opened, it did not close. The figure who ultimately capitalized on this situation was Pompey the Great. In 63 BC, Pompey entered Jerusalem, effectively bringing Judea under Roman influence. This was not a temporary alliance, it marked the end of full political independence. Judea was now integrated into the expanding Roman system, which operated on a very different scale and with different priorities than previous empires. This mattered because Rome did not function like the Persian or early Hellenistic rulers. While it often allowed local customs to continue, its primary concern was control, order, and the efficient management of territories. Local leadership could remain, but only within the framework of Roman authority. Ultimate power was no longer even regionally based, it was centralized within a vast imperial structure. One of the immediate consequences of Roman involvement was the restructuring of leadership. The Hasmonean dynasty did not disappear instantly, but its authority was significantly reduced. Political decisions were now influenced, and often determined, by Roman interests. This created a new dynamic where local leaders had to navigate not only internal divisions, but also the expectations of an external power that prioritized stability above all else. At the same time, figures like Herod the Great would later emerge under Roman authority, representing a new type of leadership, one that was closely aligned with Rome while maintaining a form of local rule. This mattered because it further complicated the concept of legitimate authority. Leadership was no longer defined solely by lineage, religious role, or internal acceptance, but also by external appointment and political alignment. Meanwhile, the religious landscape continued to reflect the divisions that had developed earlier. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and other groups maintained their distinct approaches to law and authority. Under Roman rule, these differences did not disappear. Instead, they continued to shape how the population responded to both internal and external pressures. The temple still stood. The law was still taught. Religious life continued. But the political reality had changed completely, and still, the silence remained. Despite the fall of independence, the rise of Roman control, and the restructuring of leadership, there was no widely recognized prophetic voice to interpret these events as direct messages from God. No new revelation clarified the meaning of this transition. The people were once again required to understand their situation through existing texts, traditions, and interpretation. Beat this point, nearly 4 centuries had passed since the last recorded prophetic message. The silence had endured through stability, cultural pressure, violent conflict, political expansion, internal collapse, and foreign domination. It had not been broken at any stage, and this leads directly into the next phase. Because under Roman rule, new expectations would begin to form, expectations shaped by everything that had happened during these years of silence. The promises of the past had not been forgotten. If anything, the conditions now made those expectations more urgent. The question was no longer whether God had spoken in the past. The question was whether he would speak again. And if he did, how would it happen? And after the intervention of Pompey the Great in 63 BC, Judea was no longer an independent state. It became part of the Roman sphere of control, initially functioning with a degree of local autonomy but ultimately subject to Roman authority. This marked a fundamental shift. Previous empires had ruled the region, but Rome introduced a more structured and far-reaching system of governance that emphasized order, taxation, and long-term stability. This mattered because the framework of power was now external in a more definitive way. Rome governed its territories through a combination of direct oversight and local leadership. In Judea, this meant that while certain local rulers and institutions remained in place, their authority operated within limits defined by Roman interests. Maintaining peace was the primary objective. Any form of unrest or instability was addressed quickly, often with force. One of the most significant figures to emerge in this context was Herod the Great, who was appointed by Rome as king over Judea. Herod's rule represents a clear example of how Roman authority functioned at the local level. He was not a traditional Jewish king in terms of lineage, but he was politically effective and loyal to Rome. This combination made him valuable to the empire. Even if his legitimacy was questioned by segments of the population, Herod invested heavily in large-scale building projects, including the expansion and renovation of the temple in Jerusalem. This mattered because it reinforced the central role of the temple in religious life, while also demonstrating Herod's ability to align with Jewish tradition when it served his political goals. However, his rule was also marked by strict control, surveillance, and decisive action against perceived threats. This created a dual perception of leadership. On one hand, the temple was functioning at an even larger scale than before, and religious practices continued. On the other hand, political authority was clearly tied to Roman approval, and leadership could not act independently of that relationship. This tension between religious continuity and political dependence became a defining feature of the period. At the same time, Roman infrastructure began to shape daily life. Roads, trade routes, and administrative systems connected Judea more directly to the broader empire. This increased interaction with other regions and cultures, reinforcing the already existing influence of Greek language and thought. Greek remained widely used, while Latin functioned as the administrative language of Roman governance. This mattered because it created a highly connected environment where ideas, goods, and people moved more efficiently than before. For the Jewish population, this meant that maintaining identity required navigating not just one dominant culture, but a combination of Greek cultural influence and Roman political control. Meanwhile, the internal religious landscape continued to reflect earlier divisions. Groups such as the Pharisees and Sadducees remained influential, each offering different interpretations of the law and different approaches to authority. Under Roman rule, these differences did not diminish. Instead, they shaped how various segments of the population responded to external control. Some focused on maintaining strict adherence to the law as a way of preserving identity. Others worked within the existing power structure, prioritizing stability and continuity of temple functions. These approaches were not always aligned, and without a unifying prophetic voice, they continued to develop independently. And still, the silence remained. No new prophet emerged to address Roman rule directly. No widely recognized message explained how to interpret this new political reality as part of a larger divine plan. The people had historical precedents: exile return, restoration, but none of those scenarios matched their current condition exactly. This created a growing sense of unresolved expectation, because the system was functioning, but it was not complete. And as Roman control solidified, that expectation would not decrease, it would intensify. As Roman control became fully established, daily life in Judea settled into a structured but controlled environment. The empire's primary concern was stability, and this shaped how the region was governed. Taxes were collected consistently, trade routes were secured, and any sign of unrest was closely monitored. This created a predictable system, but one that operated under constant oversight. This mattered because stability did not mean freedom. For the average person, life continued with familiar rhythms: work, family, religious observance, but always within the boundaries set by Roman authority. Economic pressure was a constant factor. Taxation supported both local administration and the broader empire, which meant that financial strain affected large portions of the population. This contributed to underlying dissatisfaction, even if it did not always result in open rebellion. At the same time, the temple in Jerusalem remained the central focus of religious life. Pilgrimages, sacrifices, and festivals continued to draw people together, reinforcing a shared identity. The expansion projects initiated by Herod the Great had made the temple more prominent than ever, both structurally and symbolically. This mattered because it preserved a visible connection to tradition, even under foreign rule. However, this continuity existed alongside a growing awareness that the current situation did not match earlier expectations. The people still had the promises recorded in their scriptures, promises of restoration, justice, and a form of leadership that would establish lasting stability. But under Roman control, those promises seemed distant. This gap between expectation and reality began to shape how people thought about the future. Different groups responded in different ways. The Pharisees continued to emphasize detailed observance of the law as the primary way to maintain identity and remain aligned with God's will. Their influence extended into daily life, offering guidance that addressed practical situations within the constraints of Roman rule. The Sadducees, maintaining their association with the temple and leadership structures, focused on preserving the existing system. Their position was tied to the continued functioning of temple operations and their relationship with those in power. This alignment provided stability, but also connected their authority to a system that many viewed as incomplete. Altar groups, such as those living in more isolated or ascetic communities, took a different approach. They withdrew from the main centers of activity, emphasizing separation and strict adherence to what they believed to be the correct interpretation of the law. This mattered because it showed that not everyone was willing to operate within the same framework. Some saw withdrawal as the only way to maintain integrity. At the same time, expectation of a coming figure began to take on greater significance. The idea of a future leader, Ephan, understood in connection with earlier promises, was not new. But under Roman rule, that expectation became more immediate. The conditions of foreign control, economic pressure, and internal division made the idea of intervention more relevant. This did not mean that everyone agreed on what that intervention would look like. Some expected a political leader who would restore independence. Others anticipated a figure who would bring spiritual renewal or judgment. These expectations were shaped by how individuals interpreted earlier texts, and without a prophetic voice to clarify them, multiple perspectives continued to exist simultaneously. And still, the silence remained. There was no new, widely recognized message to define these expectations or confirm their timing. The people continued to rely on interpretation, memory, and tradition to understand what might come next. This is where the tension reaches a new level, because expectation without confirmation does not disappear, it intensifies. And as that expectation grows, so does the urgency for something to break the silence that has defined generations. As the expectation of a coming intervention grew under Roman rule, a new challenge emerged. Not only were people waiting, but they were forming different conclusions about what exactly they were waiting for. Without a prophetic voice to define or correct these expectations, interpretation became the primary tool, and with interpretation came divergence. This mattered because expectation, when not aligned, can divide rather than unify. Many within the population began to focus on the idea of a political deliverer. This expectation was shaped by their current reality under Roman control. Foreign authority, taxation, and limited autonomy created a context where liberation was understood in practical terms. For these individuals, the promises found in earlier writings were interpreted as pointing toward a leader who would restore independence, defeat external powers, and re-establish a kingdom similar to what had existed under David. At the same time, others interpreted those same promises differently. Instead of focusing primarily on political restoration, they emphasized themes of judgment, purification, and spiritual renewal. For them, the central issue was not only external control, but internal condition. They believed that any future intervention would first address the state of the people before addressing external circumstances. These two approaches were not necessarily incompatible, but without a unifying voice to clarify their relationship, they began to develop separately. This created a situation where the same texts were producing different expectations. Another important factor was the role of teachers and leaders in shaping these interpretations. Scribes, scholars, and religious authorities influenced how people understood the law and the promises connected to it. Their explanations carried weight, especially in the absence of new revelation. However, because these leaders did not all agree, their teachings reinforced the diversity of expectation rather than resolving it. This mattered because authority was now distributed across multiple interpretive voices. At the same time, the historical memory of past deliverance continued to influence how people understood the present. The exodus from Egypt, the establishment of the kingdom, and the return from exile all followed a pattern. Crisis, intervention, restoration. This pattern shaped expectation. Many assumed that the current situation under Rome would follow a similar sequence, but there was a difference. In earlier periods, those moments of transition had been accompanied by clear prophetic guidance. Moses, the prophets, and other figures had provided direct instruction, explanation, and confirmation of what was happening. Now, that element was missing. The pattern was remembered, but the guidance that once accompanied it was absent. This increased the risk of misinterpretation. Without clear direction, It became possible to project expectations onto current events without confirmation. Some began to see potential signs of change in political developments. Others focused on strict adherence to the law as a way to prepare for what they believed was coming. In both cases, action was being taken based on interpretation rather than direct instruction. This is where tension becomes unstable. Because when expectations are high but undefined, and when authority is present but divided, the potential for misunderstanding increases. Different groups begin to move in different directions, each convinced that their interpretation is correct. And still, the silence remained. No new prophet emerged to confirm or correct these expectations. No widely accepted message clarified whether the focus should be political, spiritual, or both. The people continued to wait, interpret, and prepare each according to their understanding. This creates a critical condition moving forward, because when the silence finally breaks, it will not enter a neutral environment. It will enter a world already filled with expectations, structured, divided, and ready to respond. BT's point, the conditions created over nearly 4 centuries had reached a level of maximum tension. The political structure was defined by Roman control. The religious system was active but internally divided. The people had access to their foundational texts, but no new prophetic message had been recognized for generations. And expectations shaped by memory, interpretation, and current conditions had intensified rather than diminished. This mattered because all the necessary elements for a decisive moment were now in place. The temple in Jerusalem continued to function as the central institution of religious life. Pilgrimages brought people from different regions together, reinforcing shared identity despite geographic dispersion. At the same time, leadership remained divided between groups such as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, each maintaining influence within different areas of society. Their differences in interpretation and authority had become an accepted part of the landscape. Roman authority remained firm, order was enforced, and any movement that appeared to threaten stability was monitored closely. This created an environment where large-scale political action was difficult to organize without immediate consequences. However, this did not eliminate expectation, it redirected it. For some, it meant waiting. For others, it meant watching for any sign that change was beginning. At the same time, the broader population lived with a constant awareness of the gap between what had been promised and what was currently experienced. The idea of restoration was not abstracted, was rooted in historical precedent. But the absence of new guidance meant that no one could confirm how or when that restoration would occur. This created a condition where anticipation and uncertainty existed together. Different responses continued to develop. Some focused on maintaining strict observance of the law as preparation. Others looked for political opportunities that might signal a shift in power. Still others withdrew, emphasizing separation from what they saw as a compromised system. Each of these responses reflected a different interpretation of the same underlying expectation. This mattered because it meant that when change came, it would not be received uniformly. Another critical factor was the passage of time itself. Nearly 400 years had passed since the last widely recognized prophetic message. Generations had lived and died within this silence. For many, it was no longer experienced as an interruption, it was the normal condition. The memory of a time when God spoke regularly into current events existed, but it was distant. And yet, the expectation remained. This combination, long silence and sustained expectation, is what defines the edge of this moment. Because expectation that persists across generations does not remain passive. It accumulates. It shapes how people interpret events, how they respond to authority, and how they understand their place in history. By the time we reach this point, that expectation is not only present, it is structured, reinforced, and ready to react. And still, there is no new voice. No widely recognized prophet has emerged. No message has been recorded that carries the same authority as those that came before. The system continues, the divisions remain, and the external pressure does not decrease. Everything is in place. And that leads directly to the next phase. Because when the silence finally breaks, it will not begin in the center of power, nor through the structures that currently hold authority. It will not come through the groups that dominate interpretation or control institutions. It will begin outside those expectations. And when it does, the response will not be simple. Agreement will be recognition by some, rejection by others, and confusion across the rest. The silence has lasted long enough. What comes next will not continue at it. Will interrupt it. After nearly 4 centuries without a recognized prophetic voice, the silence does not break in Jerusalem, inside the temple, or through the established leadership. It begins in a location and through a figure that does not align with the expectations formed during those years. The setting is not political, not institutional, and not controlled by the dominant religious groups. It is the wilderness. And the figure is John the Baptist. This matters because it immediately disrupts the established pattern of authority. For generations, influence had been concentrated in structured systems, temple leadership, interpretive groups, and political figures aligned with Roman rule. But now, the first widely recognized prophetic voice in centuries emerges outside all of those systems. John does not derive his authority from institutional position. Instead, his message is recognized through its content and its alignment with earlier prophetic patterns. John's message is direct and consistent. A call to repentance. He does not begin with political reform, nor with an organized movement against Roman authority. Instead, he focuses on the condition of the people themselves. This is significant because many expectations during the silent period had centered on external change, restoration of independence, removal of foreign control, or the arrival of a political leader. John redirects attention inward, emphasizing preparation rather than immediate transformation of external conditions. At this point, people begin to respond. Crowds come out to hear him, not because he holds official authority, but because his message carries a recognizable weight. He operates in continuity with earlier prophets, both in style and content. He speaks directly, confronts behavior, and calls for change without relying on institutional approval. This matters because it signals a return to a form of communication that had been absent for generations, one that bypasses established structures and speaks directly to the people. Another important element is location. The wilderness is not random. In earlier history, it had been a place of transition, testing, and preparation. By beginning there, the message is framed as a preparation phase rather than a final resolution. This aligns with what had been indicated in the last recorded message before the silence, where a messenger was expected to come before a decisive moment. John's role fits that sequence, not as the final figure, but as the one who prepares the way. At the same time, John does not align himself with existing factions. He is not positioned as a Pharisee or a Sadducee, and he does not attempt to integrate into their systems. This matters because it prevents his message from being absorbed into existing divisions. Instead, it stands independently, addressing all groups with the same standard. His focus is not on choosing sides within the current structure, but on confronting the entire structure with a call to change. The response is not uniform. Some accept the message and respond through repentance. Others question his authority and challenge his position. This division is important because it reflects the environment shaped during the silent period on environment, where authority is debated and expectations are varied. The same conditions that had developed during the silence now influence how the breaking of that silence is received. And yet, one fact becomes clear at this point. The silence has ended. Not gradually, not through institutional reform, but through a direct message delivered by a figure operating outside the established systems. This reintroduction of a prophetic voice does not resolve all questions immediately, but it changes the condition that had defined generations. There is now a current message, not just past texts. There is now a voice addressing the present, not just interpretations of the past. And this is only the beginning. because John's role is not to complete the process, but to prepare for what comes next, and what follows will not align with the expectations that have been building for centuries. As the activity of John the Baptist expands, the impact of his message becomes impossible to ignore. What began as a movement in the wilderness starts to reach the attention of established religious leaders, including representatives connected to the Pharisees and Sadducees. This matters because, for the first time in centuries, a voice claiming authority aligned with prophetic tradition is now active in the present, and the existing leadership must decide how to respond to it. When questioned about his identity, John does not present himself as the central figure of expectation. He explicitly denies being the awaited deliverer, redirecting attention to someone who is yet to come. This is a critical clarification because it prevents immediate misinterpretation of his role. Given the heightened expectation during the silent period, it would have been easy for a figure like John to be identified as the fulfillment of those expectations. Instead, he defines himself as a preparatory voice, maintaining the sequence that had been established earlier. This matters because it resets the framework of expectation. The focus is no longer on identifying a single figure who will immediately resolve all tensions. Instead, the process is presented as sequential: preparation first, then fulfillment. This directly challenges the compressed expectations that had developed under Roman pressure, where many anticipated a rapid and decisive intervention. At the same time, John's message intensifies rather than softens. He confronts not only general behavior but also specific groups, addressing leaders directly and challenging their assumptions about status and security. This is significant because it removes the idea that identity or position alone guarantees alignment with God's will. The emphasis remains on response on actual change rather than on inherited or institutional standing. This approach creates immediate tension. Those who had built authority through interpretation, tradition, or position are now being addressed by a figure who operates outside those systems, but speaks with a level of directness that resembles earlier prophetic voices. Without a recent precedent for this kind of authority, the response is mixed. Some recognize continuity with past patterns, while others question legitimacy based on the absence of institutional validation. Another key element during this phase is the act of baptism, which becomes a visible expression of response to John's message. This matters because it introduces a public action tied to internal change. It is not a replacement for the law or the temple system, but it functions as a preparatory act, something that signals readiness for what is coming next. This adds a practical dimension to the message, moving it beyond words into observable behavior. At T's point, expectation begins to shift again. The silence has been broken, but the fulfillment of long-held hopes has not yet occurred. Instead, there is a renewed sense of immediacy combined with uncertainty. If John is not the central figure, then the question becomes more focused. Who is he preparing for? And when will that next step happen? This matters because it concentrates attention. The environment that had developed during the silent period divided interpretive and expectancies, now interacting with the present voice that confirms part of the pattern but not its conclusion. The result is heightened awareness. People are no longer waiting in abstraction. They are watching in real time, and still, not everything is revealed. John's role is clear, but the identity and nature of the one he announces are not yet fully visible within the broader population. This maintains tension rather than resolving it. The silence has ended, but clarity has not fully arrived. And that leads directly to the next development, because when the next figure appears, the expectations formed over 400 years will not disappear, they will be tested. As John the Baptist continues his role of preparation, the focus begins to shift toward the one he has been announcing. This transition is not introduced through political movement, institutional endorsement, or public declaration in centers of power. Instead, it begins quietly, in a setting that does not align with the expectations that had developed over the previous 4 centuries. The figure who emerges is Jesus Christ. This matters because the form of arrival does not match the dominant expectations of the time. Many had anticipated a figure who would immediately address Roman control, restore political independence, or establish visible authority. Instead, Jesus begins without political alignment, without military backing, and without positioning himself within existing leadership structures. His initial actions do not involve confronting Rome or reorganizing the temple system. Instead, his activity centers on teaching, healing, and engaging directly with individuals in small groups. At this point, the gap between expectation and reality becomes clear. Jesus' message includes themes that were present in earlier writings: alignment with God's will and the idea of a coming kingdom, but the way these themes are presented shifts the focus. The kingdom he speaks of is not immediately defined in political terms. This creates tension because many expected visible, external change. Instead, the emphasis often begins with internal condition, response, and recognition. This matters because it challenges established interpretations. Those who had developed expectations based on political restoration now have to reassess. The absence of immediate confrontation with Roman authority raises questions. Is this the figure that was expected, or is this something different? Without a unified interpretive authority, responses begin to diverge quickly. Another important element is how Jesus interacts with existing groups. He does not align himself fully with the Pharisees or the Sadducees, nor does he seek validation from them. Instead, he engages with them directly, sometimes agreeing with aspects of their teaching, but often challenging their interpretations and priorities. This is significant because it places him outside the established systems of authority while still addressing them directly. At the same time, his actions begin to attract attention. People respond to his teaching and the observable outcomes of his activity. This creates a growing following, not based on institutional endorsement, but on direct interaction and perceived authority. This matters because it mirrors, in some ways, the earlier emergence of prophetic voices recognized through impact rather than position. However, the response is not uniform. Some recognize continuity between Jesus' message and earlier promises. Others focus on the differences between expectation and reality, leading to hesitation or rejection. The same environment shaped during the silent period marked by interpretation. Division and expectation now determines how this arrival is received. This is where the accumulated tension of 400 years becomes visible. The silence had allowed expectations to form without correction. Now, those expectations are being tested against a reality that does not fully align with them. For some, this creates recognition. For others, it creates conflict. And still, the process is not complete. John's role as the preparatory voice is being fulfilled, but the full implications of Jesus' arrival are not yet understood by the broader population. The silence has been broken, the preparation has occurred, and the central figure has appeared, but clarity is still developing. And that leads directly to the next phase, because the response to this arrival will not remain at the level of observation. It will move into decision, alignment, and opposition. And at that point, the difference between expectation and reality will no longer be theoretical, it will define outcomes. As the presence and activity of Jesus Christ become more visible, the environment shaped over 4 centuries begins to produce clear responses. What had been a period defined by silence, interpretation, and expectation now transitions into a moment where those expectations must confront a real figure, real actions, and real teaching. This matters because the silence is no longer the defining condition. Response is. From the beginning, the reactions are not unified. Some recognize continuity between Jesus' message and the themes present in earlier writings. They see alignment in the call to repentance, in the emphasis on obedience, and in the idea of a coming kingdom. For these individuals, the lack of political framing does not immediately disqualify him. Instead, they focus on the authority of his teaching and the observable impact of his actions. At the same time, others respond differently, focusing on the mismatch between expectation and presentation. the absence of direct political action, the lack of alignment with established leadership, and the reinterpretation of certain aspects of the law create hesitation. This matters because it shows that expectation, once formed without correction, becomes a filter. Instead of evaluating the message on its own terms, some evaluate it based on whether it matches what they anticipated. This dynamic is particularly visible in interactions with established groups, religious leaders, especially those connected to interpretive authority and temple structure, engage with Jesus' teaching critically. In so many cases, the issue is not the absence of knowledge, but the challenge to existing frameworks. When authority is built on established interpretation, a new voice that redefines emphasis or exposes inconsistency creates tension that cannot be ignored. At the same time, the broader population continues to respond in varied ways. Some follow, some observe, and others remain uncertain. This range of responses reflects the environment that had developed during the silent period, an environment where authority was debated and expectations were diverse. Now, those same conditions influence how the breaking of the silence is processed. This matters because it shows that the silence did not simply delay understanding, it shaped the way understanding would occur. Another critical factor is that the process does not unfold all at once. Recognition develops over time, through repeated interaction, teaching, and response. At the same time, opposition also develops, often in parallel. This creates a situation where the same events produce different conclusions, depending on perspective, expectation, and alignment. BT's point 1, fact is no longer uncertain. The silence has ended completely. There is now an active voice addressing the present, not just the past. There is now teaching that engages directly with current conditions, not only with historical events. The pattern that had been absent for generations, direct communication influencing present decisions, has returned. However, the return of that pattern does not produce immediate unity. Instead, it produces division based on response. Some align with what is being presented, others resist it, and many remain in a position of evaluation, influenced by the expectations they carried into this moment. This division is not accidental. It is the result of how the silence shaped the environment in which the message now appears. And this leads directly to the final phase, because the question is no longer whether God has spoken again. The question is how that message is received. And the answer to that question will determine not only individual outcomes, but the direction of everything that follows. As the activity of Jesus Christ continues, the impact of his presence becomes increasingly visible across different layers of society. What began as localized teaching and interaction now expands into a broader influence that reaches both the general population and established leadership. This matters because the message is no longer contained. It is now affecting structures that had developed and stabilized during the 4 centuries of silence. At the level of the population, response continues to grow. People are drawn not only by the content of the teaching, but also by the consistency between what is said and what is done. This creates a form of authority that is recognized through direct observation rather than institutional endorsement. For many, this aligns with patterns seen in earlier prophetic periods, where recognition came through impact rather than position. However, unlike earlier periods, this recognition now exists alongside a wide range of competing interpretations shaped during the silence. At the same time, this growing influence begins to create concern among established groups, religious leaders, particularly those whose authority is connected to interpretation and temple structure. Start to view the situation as more than a difference in teaching. The issue is no longer isolated. Disagreement is the potential shift of influence away from established systems toward a figure operating independently of them. This matters because authority, once established, is rarely neutral about change. As interactions increase, points of conflict become more defined. Jesus engages directly with questions about the law, authority, and practice. In some cases, he affirms foundational elements that align with earlier teachings. In others, he challenges interpretations that had developed over time, especially when those interpretations emphasize form over substance. This creates tension because it addresses not only behavior, but the frameworks used to define correct behavior. Another key factor is the difference in priorities. Many of the existing groups had developed systems that maintained order, identity, and continuity under Roman rule. These systems were structured, predictable, and aligned with maintaining stability. In contrast, the message being presented now often emphasizes internal condition, intention, and alignment at a deeper level. This does not directly oppose the law, but it shifts the focus of how it is applied. This matters because it changes the basis of evaluation. When emphasis moves from external compliance to internal alignment, existing systems of measurement become less sufficient. This creates uncertainty for those who rely on those systems, and it introduces a different standard that is not as easily controlled or managed within established structures. At the same time, the political context cannot be ignored. Roman authority remains in place, and any movement that grows in influence is observed carefully. While Jesus does not organize political resistance, the increasing attention surrounding his activity raises concerns about how it might be perceived within the broader system. This adds another layer of tension as religious and political considerations begin to overlap. The result is a gradual escalation. What began as observation becomes evaluation. What begins as evaluation moves toward opposition, not immediately and not uniformly, but consistently. The same environment shaped during the silence marked by divided authority and varied expectations now interacts with a message that does not fully align with any one group. And this leads to a critical development, because as influence grows and opposition becomes more defined, neutrality becomes more difficult to maintain. People are no longer simply observing, they are beginning to decide. As the influence of Jesus Christ continues to expand, the tension with established authorities moves from observation into direct challenge. What had previously been a growing concern now becomes a series of confrontations that expose deeper differences in how authority, law, and obedience are understood. This matters because the conflict is no longer indirected, is now explicit and unavoidable. One of the central issues in these confrontations is authority itself. Established leaders question the basis on which Jesus teaches and acts, asking by what authority these actions are performed. This is not a casual inquiry. It reflects a structured system where authority is typically derived from recognized lineage, formal training, or institutional position. Jesus, however, does not fit within those categories. His authority is not presented as derived from existing systems, which makes it difficult to classify within the established framework. This matters because systems of authority rely on recognition. When a figure operates outside those systems, but demonstrates influence and consistency, it creates a situation where the system must either expand to include that figure or reject it. In this case, expansion would require reevaluating the existing structure, while rejection preserves it. This creates a pressure point where decision becomes necessary. At the same time, the content of the teaching continues to challenge existing interpretations. Jesus addresses not only actions, but the intent behind them, emphasizing alignment between outward behavior and internal condition. This approach exposes gaps where compliance may exist without deeper consistency. For those whose authority is tied to maintaining structured interpretation, this creates a direct challenge to how correctness is defined and measured. This matters because it shifts the criteria of evaluation. If obedience is measured only by visible compliance, then structured systems can define and enforce it. But if obedience includes internal alignment, intention, and consistency beyond external action, then the system becomes more difficult to regulate. This introduces a level of unpredictability that established structures are not designed to manage. Another factor contributing to the growing tension is public perception. As more people observe and respond to Jesus' teaching, the influence of established leaders is affected. Authority is not only a matter of position, it's also a matter of recognition. When recognition begins to shift, the stability of existing structures is impacted. This does not immediately remove authority, but it does create competition for influence. At this point, the lines begin to form more clearly. Some align with the message being presented, recognizing continuity with earlier patterns, and responding to the emphasis on internal alignment. Others align with existing leadership, prioritizing stability, structure, and the preservation of established interpretation. This division is not always public or formal, but it becomes increasingly visible through decisions, associations, and responses. The political dimension also continues to develop. While Jesus' activity is not framed as political resistance, the growing attention surrounding him raises concerns about how Roman authorities might interpret the situation. Any movement that gathers large numbers of people carries potential implications for public order, and this adds urgency to how the situation is addressed by local leadership. This matters because it accelerates. What might have remained a prolonged debate now begins to move toward resolution. The combination of growing influence, challenged authority, and external pressure creates conditions where maintaining a neutral position becomes increasingly difficult. And this leads directly to the next phase. Because once lines are drawn and positions are established, the outcome is no longer shaped by discussion alone. It is shaped by action. As the tension surrounding Jesus Christ continues to increase, the situation moves beyond open debate into coordinated opposition. What had previously been a series of confrontations now begins to take on a more structured form. This matters because the response is no longer reactive, it becomes strategic, indicating that the existing leadership has moved from evaluation to a decision about how to handle the situation. One of the key developments at this stage is the shift in how opposition is organized. Instead of isolated challenges or public questioning, efforts begin to focus on finding grounds for formal accusation. This includes closely observing actions, interpreting statements in ways that could be used against him, and identifying moments that could be presented as violations of established law or threats to order. This matters because it reflects a transition from disagreement to intent to act. At the same time, the content of Jesus' teaching continues to maintain consistency, even as opposition grows. He does not adjust his message to align more closely with existing structures, nor does he reduce the directness of his statements. This is significant because it removes the possibility of resolving the tension through compromise. The message remains unchanged, and as a result, the response to it becomes more clearly defined. Another important factor is the role of public influence. As more people gather to hear and observe, the visibility of the situation increases. This creates a dual effect. On one hand, it strengthens the influence of the message among those who respond positively. On the other hand, it increases the urgency for those who oppose it, particularly because large gatherings can draw the attention of Roman authorities. Maintaining public order is a priority under Roman rule, and any movement perceived as disruptive carries potential consequences. This matters because it introduces a time factor. The longer the situation continues without resolution, the greater the risk of external intervention. For the existing leadership, this creates pressure to address the situation internally before it escalates beyond their control. This urgency contributes to the move toward more decisive action. At the same time, internal responses among the population continue to develop. Some become more committed, aligning themselves clearly with the message being presented. Others become more cautious, observing the growing tension and waiting to see how events unfold. Still others align more strongly with established leadership, viewing the situation as a disruption to stability. These responses are not static, they evolve as the situation intensifies. This matters because it shows that the environment is no longer neutral. Every development pushes individuals and groups closer to a defined position. The conditions created during the silent period, diverse expectations, distributed authority, and reliance on interpretation now result in a fragmented response to a single, present reality. Another critical element is the increasing intersection between religious and political considerations. While the core issues involve interpretation, authority, and alignment with the law, the potential political implications cannot be ignored. Any accusation that frames a situation in political terms carries weight under Roman oversight. This creates a pathway where religious opposition can transition into political action. This is where the situation becomes irreversible. Once opposition is organized, influence is widespread, and external pressure is a factor. The process moves beyond discussion. The outcome will not be determined by agreement or clarification. It will be determined by action taken within these combined pressures, and this leads directly to the final development of this phase. Because when opposition becomes strategic and urgency increases, the next step is no longer observation or preparation. It is execution of a decision. As the situation reaches its final stage, the accumulated tension of influence, opposition, and urgency results in a decisive outcome. What had developed over time, growing recognition, increasing conflict, and structured resistance now converges into a coordinated decision. The response to Jesus Christ is no longer theoretical or partial. It becomes formal, intentional, and irreversible within the context of the existing system. This matters because it reveals the full weight of the environment shaped during the 400 years of silence. The decision is not made in isolation. It is the result of multiple factors working together. Challenged authority, differing interpretations of the law, concern over influence, and the pressure to maintain stability under Roman oversight. These elements do not operate independently. They reinforce one another, creating a situation where inaction is no longer considered a viable option by those in positions of authority. At this point, religious opposition intersects directly with political authority. Accusations are framed in a way that carries weight within the Roman system, shifting the issue from internal disagreement to a matter that requires official response. This transition is critical because it moves the outcome beyond the control of local debate and into the domain of enforced under Roman governance. Maintaining order is the priority, and any situation perceived as a potential threat is addressed accordingly. The result is execution. This outcome is not simply the removal of an individual. It represents the culmination of a process that began long before, shaped by silence, expectation, interpretation, and division. The response to the message becomes the defining factor, and that response is expressed through action rather than agreement. This matters because it shows that the breaking of the silence does not automatically produce acceptance. Instead, it produces division based on how the message is received. Some align with it, others reject it, and many are influenced by the structures and expectations that had developed over generations. The same silence that created anticipation also created frameworks that affected recognition. When the message finally arrived, it did not enter a neutral environment, it entered a structured one. At the same time, the outcome does not end the process. The removal of the central figure does not eliminate the impact of what has been presented. The message, the actions, and the responses that have already taken place continue to influence those who were part of the process. This creates a continuation that extends beyond the immediate event, even as the official decision has been carried out. This is where consequence becomes visible. For those who aligned with the message, the outcome requires re-evaluation of expectation and understanding of what has occurred. For those who opposed it, the decision reinforces the preservation of existing structures. For those who remained uncertain, the result forces a reassessment of what they have observed. And this leads directly into the final phase, because the question is no longer about expectation or recognition during the silence. The silence has been broken, the message has been delivered, and the response has been made. Now the question becomes, what does all of this mean in the larger sequence, and how should it be understood in light of everything that came before? Looking back across these 400 years, the silence was not an empty space in history. It was a period that produced specific conditions, political, religious, and interpretive, that directly shaped what happened when the silence finally ended. This matters because without understanding what developed during that time, the response to what followed cannot be fully explained. Politically, The region moved from Persian stability to Greek cultural pressure, then through violent conflict under Seleucid rule, followed by a brief period of independence, and finally into the structured control of Rome. Each transition introduced new pressures and forced adjustments. By the time Roman authority was fully established, the people were no longer simply maintaining identities. They were doing so under a system that prioritized order over autonomy. This created a context where expectations of change were not theoretical, but urgent. Religiously, the absence of a prophetic voice shifted authority toward interpretation. Priests, scribes, and later, distinct groups, such as the Pharisees and Sadducees, developed systems to preserve and apply the law without new revelation. This mattered because it created structure, but also division. Different groups formed around different approaches, and without a unifying voice. Those differences were not resolved, they were maintained and reinforced over generations. At the same time, expectation did not disappear during the silence. It accumulated. The promises recorded in earlier texts remained active in the collective memory, but without new clarification, they were interpreted in multiple ways. Some expected political restoration. Others focused on spiritual renewal. These expectations were not corrected or unified during the silence, which meant that by the time the silence ended, the environment was already divided in how it would interpret what came next. This is the key point. The silence did not only delay a message, it shaped the way the message would be received. When the voice returned through John the Baptist, it did not emerge within the established systems. And when Jesus Christ appeared, the response was not uniform because the expectations were not uniform. The same message entered a fragmented environment, and as a result, it produced recognition in some, rejection in others, and uncertainty across the rest. This matters because it explains the outcome. The division that followed was not created at the moment the silence ended, it was revealed. It had been forming throughout the 400 years, shaped by interpretation, authority, and expectation without direct correction. When the silence broke, it did not create new conditions, it exposed the ones that already existed. At the same time, the silence also preserved something. It preserved the texts, the structure of worship, and the continuity of identity. Without that preservation, there would be no framework to interpret what followed. Even though interpretation diverged, the foundational material remained intact. This created the possibility for recognition, even within a divided environment. So the silence had two effects at the same time. It preserved the foundation, and it allowed divergence to develop, and both of those effects became visible when the silence ended. Now, the sequence is complete. The last message before the silence established expectation. The silence shaped the environment. The return of a voice reintroduced direct communication, and the response revealed how that environment would process what it received. The question, then, is not only historical, it is about response, because the same pattern remains: message, interpretation, and decision. Before we close, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And in the comments, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? And one more question after seeing the full picture. Do you believe the silence was primarily a form of judgment, preparation, or something else?